AI in defense scares me.
Yes.
Have you seen the trailer for the film The Creator?
I have, yeah.
Have you seen it?
Yes, the trailer, yeah.
Yeah, where the AI decided to deploy a nuke on LA.
Aliens will stop that.
Yeah, I mean, so sometimes you need so just to that very basic point of like, can an AI generate prompts for itself? Like that can happen now. You just like take two models and you say, this model generates a prompt that goes in this model, and this model generates. And so you can have that kind of, like circular back and forth now, and you can do as much many different permutations as you want. But that doesn't mean necessarily you get this sort of emergent, like high risk capability, right? That's a separate thing, which is, does that lead to, as a separate question, are you ever getting to a point with like recursive self-improvement? Right now, fundamentally, the capabilities of these models are much more tied to like the size of the underlying LLM, right? And then there's like enhancements with fine tuning and, like more customizations and plugins. And and then these agents could cause trouble, right? Socioeconomic trouble, cybersecurity trouble, but like those sorts of risks, which are really important and probably the things we're really going to face the next, 12 to 36 months of like, as these things get really capable, they're not going to be like world-ending risks, but they're just going to be disruptive security risks, maybe some like just like adding more volatility to the labor market, right? It may not be that everyone just loses their job, but it means that what it is that you have to do in your job and what companies are looking for could radically change. And the volatility associated with that could create its own friction and economic and political instability. So those are like the near-term risks that I see. But then there is like the big risk that everyone in AI is always like, on different sides of, which is the sort of the takeoff scenario, right? Is that you get to a point where these systems are so capable that they can self-improve, right? And that sets up the classic feedback loop where now it becomes a better designer and implementer of its own code or some variation thereof. And we become irrelevant to its future progress. And it could go very quickly depending on how you build in those assumptions. So that's a separate risk of like the AI takeoff risk sort of, and then if you get AI takeoff, there's a separate, which is, okay, is that a benign takeoff? Is that a, utopian takeoff, or is that an existential takeoff, right? And so you have to like, do a whole different set of analysis to figure out what that means down the line. But yeah, right now, this is an acute geopolitical topic. I mean, there was just a conference a few weeks ago in DC by the Special Competitive Studies Project on global emerging technology. It was basically focused on AI, and it was set up by a bunch of folks that had come out of the White House leading AI efforts. Now they have sort of this independent think tank. It's basically funded and sponsored by Eric Schmidt, and they brought the sort of movers and shakers in the intelligence and defense communities with tech to try to get their arms around this stuff because they see it potentially being a strategically destabilizing force in geopolitics in the next few years. And so they really want to try to understand where this is going. And everyone's playing catch up. There's like three main sort of like major geopolitical actors that are all trying to navigate this. It's basically US, UK as kind of like a conjoined group, the European Union, and China. And China with like the Middle East essentially as a proxy. And so each of those major power centers and technological power centers are trying to jockey for position, both on like the core technology and getting to the frontier, as well as like the regulatory and policy dynamic. And so the European Union has sort of a regulatory superpower with GDPR, the data protection laws. They're trying to throw their weight around and try to put in place a set of guidelines and a framework. They have an AU Act that's close to final drafting. And that's their first mover to try to like put in place some guardrails around the development of these systems across society. It so happens they don't really have any leading AI companies, right? So it's kind of this geopolitical and political negotiation. Most of the leading labs are in the UK and the US, right? Between DeepMind, Anthropic, OpenAI, et cetera. And then you got China. And China is, kind of a black box when it comes to this stuff. And you also have the Middle East, which is, in my opinion, kind of an extension of China's efforts in this space as well. And China is, rapidly trying to catch up. Right? We're trying to contain them technologically, which we had these October 7th export controls on advanced semiconductors that have shown to be a bit weak. And meanwhile, they've been stockpiling GPUs like it's going out of style. And so there is an acute arms race to stockpile the fundamental hardware, race to the frontier. The security threat to these foundation model companies is extreme, right? It's like almost like the Manhattan Project levels of strategic importance, but they're like semi-startups, right? And their CEOs do podcasts, and everyone knows who their leading engineers are, right? So the security model of a leading foundation model developer company is sort of unprecedented, and they have to take like extreme levels of precaution in terms of how they protect their weights, how they compartmentalize internal, IP, and it is a. I mean, we saw like model weights leak. I mean, we've seen this is like you do $100 million training run to generate these weights, and then you have all your special tools and tricks to, that give you a competitive edge. That's just like that's not like you have to load up the truck, right? That's a piece of data that you just need to get out, right? And so the threat of like insider coercion or inducement is very real, as well as just the basic sort of trying to penetrate their cybersecurity protections. And so this is like kicking it up a notch in terms of the threat landscape for these companies. And I think there's a reason why you saw like they're all kind of hitched to a big tech company, right? With whether it's Google, Microsoft, et cetera. But it's going to be a major fault line in the next few years about how fast this technology goes and whether there's like a political resistance to try to slow things down, right? There's already been this letter about we need to slow pace of these development. There's to be like some sort of like spontaneous agreement between these leading developing companies to, suspend training of the next model. I don't think that's going to happen. Like already they're talking about the design, like the layout for the next generation of data centers that they're going to train these are going to basically be like they're going to cost as much as like an aircraft carrier, right? And they're going to be custom design, and it's going to be their major logistics challenge now is basically power. Like it's going to consume huge amounts of power.
But I don't see again the same pressure that Bitcoin miners get. I don't see the regulatory lens. I don't see Elizabeth Warren coming down and say, "Well, we need to stop."
That's probably going to come.
I think it'll depend on like, whether it's like OpenAI who are dominating the market, or there'll be lots of open source, smaller AI projects, and it's more unregulated.
But can you really regulate AI? It feels like the cat's out of the bag now.
So one policy proposal that's very concrete, that's an active discussion, as like one piece of this. It's a multifaceted regulatory nut to crack, but DC is trying to get their arms around it. One policy proposal that was put out, it came from two different directions actually. So there was a policy proposal that came out from CSET, which is the Center for Strategic Emerging Technology, back in May. It's like a DC think tank that was just about how to close some of these loopholes in the export controls, technology controls on China. It had nothing to do with AI to first order, but it was all about basically KYC for cloud service providers. So as Chester was mentioning, there's just modern digital civilization, enterprise networks, and governments run on data centers, right? It's just data centers everywhere, and all the information flow of our civilization is basically like premised on the existence of these cloud service providers that operate, build, maintain these cloud infrastructures. And so those are kind of the nodes of the global digital world. And so just like you have KYC for the digital monetary network, right? That is the dollar hierarchical correspondent banking system. You can imagine imposing a similar KYC surveillance and choke point regime over global cloud infrastructures, with the purpose to first order in this policy proposal of limiting the ability of a Chinese entity from, say, evading the export controls by running a compute load in, say, a Singapore data center, right, or an Australian data center or a Japanese data center, where they're just getting access to the same compute. It's just in a geography in a different country. That's a loophole in the current tech controls. The AI is like, well, that's like you can easily imagine that being repurposed to do better control and surveillance over what sorts of training is being conducted on these data centers, right? And providing maybe at least to first order, just like reporting requirements. Like we, the government, have to know every time you're running a certain model of a certain size. And we also maybe want to inspect its capabilities before you release any software into the wild, right? That you can imagine a sort of a regulatory regime emerges where these sorts of safety reviews and precautionary principles gets instantiated in a new kind of cloud infrastructure surveillance regime, all the way up to we effectively nationalize, right, these companies because they're too strategically important. And so I think you're seeing these companies, which kind of like, it's like the dog that caught the car, right? Like, they thought that this was going to happen, but I think until they actually saw the results coming out of GPT-3, 3.5, now 4, and then they're, the scaling laws seem to be keeping up. And so it's pretty straightforward to just look to see where things are going to be in 2 to 3 years. And, they're going to be extremely capable. And I think they're trying to mitigate ahead of time the likely political and regulatory reaction. So they're trying to come up with their own voluntary regimes. They're trying to diffuse maybe an overreaction on the part of governments. And they're trying to shape a regulatory regime that gives them sufficient freedom to continue to grow exponentially, bring just ungodly sums of return to their investors. But I think they're also worried about the massive spillovers, that if they release something and it causes, havoc, that's going to bring the hammer down on them, right? And so they're trying to balance the growth pace with the security concerns. And I think we're going to see in the next 6 to 12 months the outlines of this framework for potential multinational AI regulation start to come into place, or at least frameworks for that. But it's going to be heavily contested. And like one example of like where this, can be easily undermined is if you look at the October 7th semiconductor controls that the Commerce Department released. When they were announced, it was like, this is the high fence, small yard, but we're really going to limit China's ability to catch up to the technological frontier in semiconductors for AI as well as quantum computing and, like nuclear missile simulations. And it, generated a lot of headlines. It was like, China's never going to be able to catch up. Like this is like a death blow to Huawei and SMIC and all these other, leading national champions. And Huawei just released, their own indigenously developed, really advanced 7-nanometer chip with SMIC and the Huawei phone. And using indigenous designs, like when you're really under the gun, you can innovate. And that capability of innovating for these semiconductor chips for the smartphone is like this technology is like a ladder, right? And so like smartphone chips, and then in like wireless chips, and then going up, you can kind of climb the value chain in chip production to AI, like super chips, basically. And so this is going to become an intense geopolitical issue. But like we saw with the Commerce Department rules that effectively they were packed with loopholes that only like the niche industry experts understood, like certain tools that looked like they were like legacy generation, but are effectively able to move, help China move down, the chip size, just using DUV technology. But basically Western companies and Japanese and South Korean and Dutch companies, they want to grow their margins. They want to keep selling. And so they have an intense incentive to try to shape the control lists in a way that really only they can understand because they're the deep industry experts. And the Commerce Department kind of relied on them to help them shape which tools should be on the list, et cetera. Something like that could happen here, which is whatever, maybe the prudent bar for that policy objective should be set at. The industry has an interest in making that bar slightly higher, right? So that they can, keep growing and scaling. But yeah, it's a major issue. So the geopolitics and the regulatory regime, I've been rambling for a while, but like one last point is Sam Altman went to Beijing, and even Elon went to Beijing, and the pitch to the officials there was, you need to kind of come on board with us. We need to sort of forget these tribal divisions because AI could be a strategic challenge to humanity at large. And we need to all basically get on the same page here. And especially for you all, you think you can control this thing, but there's a risk that you can't control it. And the CCP, if they lose control, like that's the end. That's their major nightmare, right? And so he was trying to like convince them that, they need to kind of be a part of this global regulatory regime. I think it was a little bit naive. But that's kind of that's the mentality of some of the leaders of our major AI development companies. And so,
but can AI itself not just escape? Is that not the risk? The escaping AI?
Yeah, that's a big topic.
A little bit like what's that film? Her?
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, Her.
Yeah, where she goes off and she escapes.
Well, I mean, you can imagine like these systems advancing pretty quickly into a point where they build in their own backdoors.
Yeah,
around the meta prompting, around the guardrails, around the security.
Don't tell the humans.
Yeah, well, it's fun. You say that, but I mean, ChatGPT already lies to humans. Like, it all.
Do we know the reasons? Where does it lie and what reasons?
Well, I mean, it's in the incentive structure of a large language model. Like, it's trying to give you an answer that you want to receive, right? And so, like, trying to get you to your solution, which might, in some ways, involve being dishonest with you.
But that's that. But does it will it lie to you maliciously?
Well, that is where the frontier of what's called alignment research really is right now, is if you can almost like what these large language models are, right, is like a big inscrutable mess of floating point numbers, right? They're just like a massive matrix, right? And so, but they encode just huge amounts of associative relationships and patterns that when you prompt, essentially it causes this cascade and then it generates the output. But we don't really know what's happening like inside the box, right? So a lot of the AI alignment research is trying to essentially do like neuroscience for these LLMs, right? Trying to come up with techniques that allow us to like almost X-ray the brain, right? And try to figure out at like the sort of individual level inside these very complicated networks, like what's being encoded. And so this is called mechanistic interpretability. And there was actually a recent result like a few days ago by Anthropic, which is one of those sort of foundation model labs that's really focused on like alignment or AI safety. As like that's their raison d'etre. And so they have shown like a pretty impressive result. That's like net good news from that perspective, because what they're able to show is that with a relatively simple model, not like the most advanced model, that you actually can get like high scrutability in terms of what different concepts is being encoded sort of at the micro level in these networks, which to that point of like detecting deception, right? You could essentially like read the mind of the AI in real time and then see if there's deceptive circuits going on. Now that's still very speculative, right? This is like the basic sort of research breakthrough to see, can we actually know what's happening sort of inside at kind of more like the atomic level? Now, scaling that sort of methodology to the whole model and to these leading models and understand, are there like patterns of behavior that we can detect? It's sort of like you can X-ray a human or do an MRI on a human brain, and you can see sort of morphological features associated with psychopathy. So like psychopaths have a different brain structure, and you can MRI those brains. You can detect this person is a psychopath. Now, if you're just talking to a psychopath, they have superficial charm. They're often, very fluent and can be very engaging and charming, but they're just lying to you, right? They're just manipulating you, right? Now, human beings like are right now vulnerable to psychopaths. They can be very successful. If we had like a walking MRI detector that you could like scan on someone's head and be like, oh no, you're a psychopath, I'm not gonna believe anything you're telling me, right? It's like how to develop the equivalent of that for these models so you can look for sort of perverse instantiation, right? So when you give it a prompt, you want to be able to check that there isn't some sort of perverse instantiation of that prompt, that goal that you're giving to the AI agent essentially, so that it sort of stays aligned with what you intended when you gave it that prompt. It's an unknown scientific and engineering challenge to see whether you can do that. But one of the sort of building blocks of a solution would be to have mechanistic interpretability, to have this sort of MRI for these LLMs and develop a way of, pretty efficiently understanding like what sorts of processes and reasoning is happening inside. And then there's a separate question of like intervening, right? Just because it's lying to you and is about to do bad stuff, well, can you steer it, right? So like interpretability is not the same thing as steerability when it comes to like AI alignment research. So there's a whole separate path of like, okay, how do you steer these systems, right? There's like the just pull the plug or delete it sort of thing, but that's kind of a little bit crude. It's more like, okay, can you selectively like edit out, the bad thoughts, right? Can you go in there and be like, change those just those parameters so it is benign. That's the hope, is that you by having these sort of diagnostic analytical tools, that maybe then you can think about strategies for controlling these things and keeping them aligned with our intentions. It's an unknown problem, and I think this is what causes a lot of anxiety in like the AI research community is, which one's going to win, right? Like, is the capabilities going to take off too fast before we figure out how to like effectively, steer and interpret what they're doing? And that's what's motivating some of this slowdown, is like, give it time for these methodologies to catch up. The last point I'll say is like, the counter argument to like the slowdown thesis is that we need to have more AI capabilities to actually understand how to control AI. So there's this argument that you need to accelerate foundational knowledge to solve the AI alignment problem. And the only way to solve the AI alignment problem, to accelerate that foundational knowledge, is to advance AI. And so you're kind of in this, high risk game, which is like, we need to make the AIs better to help us control AIs, right? And but that's where the debate is right now. Whether that debate's going to matter because these things are just going to keep improving, open question.